Trump's recent statements on Ukraine and NATO have sent shockwaves through the international community. He has suggested that Ukraine initiated the war, criticized President Zelensky, and proposed direct negotiations with Russia, raising concerns about potential concessions to Moscow. What does this mean for Ukraine's security? Are there alternatives if NATO membership is off the table? To discuss these pressing questions, we're joined by Kurt Volker, former U.S. ambassador to NATO and former U.S. special representative for Ukraine. Kurt, I'm happy to have you here.
It's great to be with you. Thanks very much.
So we hear a lot from Trump and different U.S. representatives, and not once did Trump state that he wanted to negotiate with Russia like a business deal. Can the U.S. negotiate in policy with a business approach when war and human lives are at stake? What do you think?
Well, that's just Trump's way of looking at the world. He thinks in terms of negotiations. He met with President Zelensky back in September, if you remember, in New York, and they did a press conference. They did two press conferences, and he said, look, once he's elected, he's going to get into office, he's going to call Putin, and he's going to tell him to end the war. And he's had several exchanges with President Zelensky since then, both in Paris and over the phone. And so no surprise at all that he's going to engage Putin directly, and indeed he did. It is not that different from what we did even 5-7 years ago when Victoria Nuland was the special representative, and then when I replaced her. We would have a lot of consultations with Ukraine, but then separate meetings with Russia, with the French and Germans, European Union, NATO. So those sorts of things are normal. I think what people are reacting to is that they don't know what Trump's going to do. They have a great deal of uncertainty about what his position is and what he's thinking. What I would say is that it's very clear that Trump is determined to end the fighting, and he wants to do that as quickly as possible. And that could be a good thing, provided we have guarantees for Ukraine's future security, guarantees of Ukraine's sovereignty and independence, and we are shifting towards a mode where we're integrating Ukraine into Europe and disputing Russia's occupation of Ukrainian territory by non-military means.
Yes, but I mean, how Ukrainians are reacting, this is crazy. You know, there is a joke, Kurt, in Ukraine right now. So Ukrainians are trying to go to bed before Trump waking up, you know, in order not to have a heart attack before they're going to sleep. This is quite a cynic, but this is the reality we're having right now.
No, I know exactly what you mean. And the same thing happens to everybody in Washington. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs woke up this morning to find he's no longer chairman of the Joint Chiefs. So it is a very volatile, unpredictable, and frustrating way to behave. I think in the end, however, this is going to work out. I'm still cautiously optimistic. He, in his first week in office, made clear that he knows that it's Putin that has to stop the war and that Russia is in a weakening position. And so I think seeing that is good. As you said in your opening, he has said a lot of things wrong about Ukraine as well, such as Ukraine starting the war and President Zelensky being a dictator. I think he said those things because he was upset about some of the pushback that President Zelensky has given to the proposal on minerals or to J.D. Vance's speech in Munich. So I think because of that, and saying that Trump lives in a disinformation space, he was just upset. And so I think he responded with those kind of statements. But I think if we get past this phase here, I do think things are going to get back on track.
Yeah, I hope for that too. And, you know, there are a lot of information that Ukraine owns something to the United States. But, okay, what has the U.S. gained from supporting Ukraine? In other words, do you agree that Ukrainians are sacrificing their future so Americans and Europeans don't have to?
Right. So that is not Donald Trump's view. It doesn't mean it's, I agree with him. I'm just explaining what his view is. He believes that the U.S. taxpayers should not have had to pay $100 billion for Ukraine to survive and still not have a plan for ending the war. So that's his belief. I agree with you. I think that Ukrainians have tied up Russia in Ukraine so that people in the Baltic states, in Finland and Poland, don't have to think about Russian attacks there, at least not now. So I think Ukraine is doing a great service to Europe as a whole. And I think it's a shared interest that Ukraine defeat Russian forces and that Ukraine be a full part of a transatlantic community. But as I said, Trump is coming at this from a different place. He sees everything transactionally. And so that's why he's put together this proposal on sharing the benefits of Ukrainian natural resources, because that would be a way to have the U.S. paid back and a way for Ukraine to get resources and defense articles and to develop all at the same time. So I think that's the way he's looking at it, even though I'm with you. I think there's a lot more at stake than just that.
We will come back to the national resources, but just let me also stay on the American president's statements. He said that Russia has all the cards. From your perspective, isn't that a poor negotiation tactic? Don't you think Trump is playing quite a dirty tactic in negotiations, saying that saying that?
Yeah. First off, I just think it's factually wrong. Russia doesn't have all the cards. Russia is relying on troops and artillery from North Korea. They're relying on drones from Iran. They can't recruit enough people. They can't produce enough equipment. Their economy is declining quickly because of inflation, because of high interest rates, because of a labor shortage, because of a lack of access to certain components. So I don't think they're holding all the cards. I think they're in a very tough position as well, and we should be pushing on them. And I think what Trump meant by saying that they have all the cards is he was trying to put some pressure on Ukraine not to ask for too much, but just to end the war. Again, not my view, not the way you should go about it, but I think that's what he's doing.
And Mr. Volker, you have repeatedly emphasized that full NATO membership for Ukraine is the only effective deterrent against Russia. Do you believe that proposed alternatives, such as stationing NATO forces on Ukrainian territory without formal membership, can provide a comparable level of security?
Yeah, the way I would put it is that NATO membership is a 10 out of 10, and Budapest Memorandum is a 0 out of 10. Okay. And so somewhere in between, security assurances from many countries, troop presence, backup from the United States, enablers from the United States, that might get you up to a 7 or an 8. And that's better than 0, but it's not NATO membership. And the key thing is that it has to be sufficient to guarantee that Putin doesn't attack again. And that's still something we have to focus on and work on. So I think it's where we're headed right now, is that we'll have this mixture of security guarantees and European troop presence. That can be a stepping stone to NATO membership later. It's important that we don't take NATO off the table, but it can still be effective as a deterrent if it's done right.
Okay, but about that European troops presence in Ukraine, Mr. Volker, where? I mean, definitely not the front line, right? Where they have to be in Ukrainian territory?
The key thing to do is to define exactly what the mission of the forces will be. And then once you have that, then you can answer questions like numbers, types of equipment, location, things like that. If it were up to me, I would say that it is a training and equipping mission which brings its own air defense capabilities. And so they contribute directly to Ukraine's air defense. They help train and equip the Ukrainian forces, and they have an over-the-horizon capability that is even stronger, so that if there are attacks, future attacks from Russia, they're also in a position to respond to those attacks. That, I think, should be the concept. If that is the concept, then no, you don't need to be stretched across the front line. In fact, that may not be efficient, and you have well-trained, experienced Ukrainian soldiers who can do that. You probably want the European forces to be embedded with Ukrainian military units behind the front lines, where they can make sure that they are providing and the training and equipment in as direct a way as possible. And as far as numbers go, I think you're talking tens of thousands rather than hundreds of thousands.
I see. Do you think we are approaching to that deal? How realistic is that indeed?
You know, as much as there is great frustration in Ukraine right now and worry, I still have the feeling that things are moving in a certain direction. It feels to me like we're going to have a ceasefire, and then we're going to have a focus on deterrence, which would involve a European troop presence and security assurances and things like that. The only thing I would say is that the U.S. is probably going to have to provide backup to that. And then that European troop presence answers an important issue for the United States, which is burden sharing. Because the U.S. feels it has been doing too much, wants to see Europe do more. So this is where I think it's headed: ceasefire, deterrence, and burden sharing. And that, I think, is a good outcome and would be somewhat sustainable.
Senator Lindsey Graham suggested a fast-track NATO membership mechanism for Ukraine in case of a new Russian attack in order they will break the peace deal. Do you think this approach is realistic, and could it be an effective alternative?
Well, I think it's a good idea. The best idea is just to bring Ukraine into NATO now. Second best idea is what Lindsey Graham said. But I don't think President Trump is going to go there. I think the most we can expect from President Trump at this stage is a U.S. commitment to back up European allies who provide security assurances for Ukraine, and not to rule out NATO membership in the future. If we can get that, I think that would be a good outcome, considering Trump's views. And
what about the gray zones? You stated that lasting peace in Europe is impossible without these clear borders and the elimination of the gray zones that could be encourage Russian aggression. In your opinion, how can this be achieved without this granting Ukraine full NATO membership?
Well, no, it can't. That's exactly the point. That's why I say you can't take it off the table.
Okay.
Better to do it now. But if you can't do it now, get something that's somewhat credible for deterrence, and then look at NATO membership down the road. But I think that, just as you stated it, that is ultimately the basic facts. You're not going to have a permanent peace in Europe until you close down these gray zones and Putin is deterred from attacking any countries.
Okay. Let's move on to that. Earlier we studied that American President Trump stated that Ukraine has effectively agreed to allow the U.S. access to the rare earth metals in exchange for military support. Do you think such an arrangement that we haven't signed yet could undermine Ukraine's sovereignty?
I don't think so. First off, it's something that Ukraine and the United States would do as a partnership. It is a situation now where Ukraine cannot fully develop these resources. So it's sitting on a bunch of wealth. It needs weapons and support, and yet it can't convert the one into the other, and the U.S. can help with that. So we can actually help turn these resources into the value that they represent, and then with that, get Ukraine continued military support. It would also make the U.S. vested, make the U.S. committed to Ukraine's own security, because our own interests will be tied up in that as well. So I think that's a good thing. And what I would say, too, is that if we do this now, if Ukraine agrees and the U.S. agrees, it's not the end of time, that things will happen over time. Things can change. So I think for the purposes of aligning the United States and Ukraine on the military effort and on the economic recovery, it's probably a good idea right now. And then, tomorrow is another day.
Yeah, but does this set a precedent where military assistance is exchanged for natural resources?
I think there actually was a precedent for that in Iraq. So I think that something similar was done there, Iraq and Syria. But the bottom line here is that we've lost the ability in the United States to provide military support to Ukraine on a taxpayer-funded basis. And we're not going to get the votes in the Congress. The president probably won't support it. So we're not going to be able to just provide gifts of aid to Ukraine. So this is a way to make it more of a transaction, which is sustainable and politically can be supported in the U.S. You could get support for this in the House, the Senate, and with the president. So I think it changes the dynamic between the U.S. and Ukraine if we do this, and changes it in a positive and sustainable way.
Yeah, it definitely changes the dynamic. But how the other statements of Trump's that we discussed earlier, that Zelensky is a dictator and all the other stuff, how it's going to affect the European support of Ukraine? Don't you think we're under the threat of, something's going to change in that matter?
Interesting. What Trump does, and he seems to do it all the time, is shock people and provoke people and criticize people. And that provokes a reaction. And so what we've seen in Europe now is after a shocking speech by J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference, the European leaders got together the following Monday to talk about what they can do on their own to increase defense capability and to provide support to Ukraine. So they're doing it out of anger and fear, but it's exactly the right thing to do, and it's what Trump would have wanted them to do. So even though it is creating all these levels of irritation, it is also producing, I think, a constructive response from Europe to look at what more they can do for Ukraine and for their own defense.
Yes, but don't you think that all this rhetoric of the White House is playing on Kremlin's hands? I'm opening social media and people are happy in Russia. What they are hearing, they are happy, unfortunately.
I see that as well. I know that that's the case. We don't know what comes next. The only way you actually end up with a ceasefire is to get Putin to stop fighting. It's not Ukraine that caused this war, and it's not Ukraine that's prolonging this war. It's Russia. So if you can get Russia to stop fighting, that would be a positive result. If they're happy, as you say, they may think that they're off the hook, but it may mean that Trump is now having established some things that make them happy, to continue to push them on the military side and the economic and the energy side.
Oh yeah,
and sanctions.
Honestly, what I'm reading right now, that lots of people trying to create any kind of conspiracy theories that behind the Trump's words and new American president and all his team, there are some meaning, but I don't trust there are some special meaning behind that.
I don't think we should be searching for coherence.
Okay.
Because Trump says one thing in the morning and a different thing in the afternoon. He's very volatile. He is going after many, many things at once. He shut down USAID. He's threatening tariffs against Canada. He's threatening tariffs against the European Union. He has now backed off of tariffs to China, so he's trying to cut a deal there, but that could very well flip back again. As I mentioned, he just fired the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the heads of some of the military services. Very unpredictable, very shocking, very dramatic, and it's just his style of doing things. And I wouldn't look for any greater explanation than that.
But does everyone in the United States agree with him? I mean, people closer to him.
Well, when you say people closer to him, you have people that he's hired into the government, the Secretary of State, National Security Advisor. They are doing their jobs. They are reporting to the president. They are gathering information. They are presenting ideas. But Trump is the only one making decisions here. This is a very top-down administration.
I see. Well, Mr. Volker, I hope for better, but for now that were my old questions. Yeah, I hope for better.
My hope, it's very frustrating. It's emotionally very difficult for Ukrainians. It makes people angry. But I would try to stay focused on the goal here and not to overreact to Trump as a personality. The goal is ending the war, making sure Ukraine is secure as a sovereign and independent European democracy, so it's safe, not recognizing Russia's occupation of Ukrainian territory, and putting Ukraine on the track to economic development, the greater prosperity and membership in the EU, and eventually NATO. That's where we need to go. And as emotionally difficult as it is, because things make people angry, I would just stay focused on the goal.
Yeah, I'm just worried that, Trump will not weaken our positions in all this negotiation process.
Well, I think that it's not so much weakening Ukraine's position. It's an outcome to discussions with Ukraine and Russia, the EU, and so forth that's going to be acceptable to Ukraine. And here, I would just point out that Marco Rubio, even immediately after the meeting with Lavrov, said that any outcome is going to be something that's agreed by all the parties that are concerned. So that's what he's saying. I would stick with that. And it's going to be a very wild ride over the next several weeks and months. And I would just stay focused on the goal.
Thank you so much, Mr. Volker, for your answers. Kurt Volker, former U.S. ambassador to NATO and former